Here we are outside of McNeil High School, where every day we see hundreds of students flock to buses, streetcars, and automobiles. On a small scale, this might seem like an insignificant part of day-to-day life, but our research shows us that city populations are increasing rapidly, and while just over 50% of the population resides in cities, they account for 75% of global resource consumption. In order to make our world more environmentally friendly, we must look at ways to make the highly disorganized transportation systems in cities more efficient.
The first step is to determine the objective. The central idea behind this report is the UNESCO Sustainable Development Goal number 7, which is access to clean and affordable energy. Our team recognized that the transportation sector has a long way to go in order to try and achieve this goal. This is why with our report, we decided to try and focus on the transportation sector and more specifically, public transport. The objective of our report is to prove public transport systems can have a major part on the local and global climate emissions, as well as to show how effective public transport systems that utilize clean energy can help reduce emissions. The third step was to clean the data. In order to clean our data and make it more usable, we imported our spreadsheets into Google Sheets. Here, we deleted the variables which were not relevant to our objectives of our report. The fourth step was to interpret the data. To get our data in a form we were able to interpret, we used Google Sheets and Google Collaboratory. We initially developed a correlation matrix, which we determined the correlation strength between each variable in our dataset. Then, to more easily spot which correlations were strong, we plotted the correlation scores in a heat map. After determining which correlations were strong, our team brainstormed to determine whether each correlation was related to transport or due to outside factors. After finding correlations which were a result of transportation, we graphed the data using a scatter plot, then added a linear regression model to the graphs and determined the R-square value. In our report, we also used a pie graph to show how important the transportation sector is in regards to emissions.
Cities are responsible for the vast majority of carbon emissions in the world. Two factors of a city that affect carbon emissions are population and area. As the population of cities increase, so does the city's carbon emissions. This can be seen in our first graph. It is clear to see that there is a general trend that suggests that in cities, a higher population leads to a higher carbon footprint. Likewise, as the areas of cities expand, the carbon emissions tend to increase. This can be seen in our second graph. We compared the area of cities to their carbon emissions. The trend line in this graph shows a positive trend in the data. This tells us that as an area of a city increases, the emissions also increase. Both of these factors are exactly what public transport aims to address. The function of public transport is to move a large number of people over varying distances. This graph shows that public transport has the possibility to greatly reduce emissions in cities. It shows the carbon emissions per capita of the cities with the top 5 most sustainable public transport systems, according to Forbes. The red line represents the average emissions per capita in the United States, which is a good representation of a developed nation. This goes to show how effective and sustainable public transport has the possibility to reduce the emissions per capita of industrialized developed nations.
Transportation is important to focus on in order to reduce emissions because of how much of the carbon emissions it is responsible for. In the US, the transportation sector is responsible for 29% of greenhouse gas emissions. This is more than any other sector. With the use of clean and affordable energy technologies, it is possible to greatly reduce the emissions from the transportation sector. My colleague will touch on these technologies later in the presentation. The reason we chose to focus specifically on public transportation is because it is effective at moving large crowds of people in an efficient manner. Effective public transportation produces far less emissions compared to single occupancy vehicles that many people use to commute to work. This can be seen in the graph. Single occupancy vehicles produce up to 4.7 times as much CO2 per mile compared to bus transit when full. And although carpooling does lower emissions, public transport is still more efficient in the vast majority of scenarios. A huge chunk of global carbon emissions come from the transportation sector, and it is therefore essential to analyze the data in order to fully understand the problem. However, looking at vast amounts of data from hundreds of data points can be confusing and hard to understand. Therefore, let's focus down to a more relatable level and talk about one city in particular, Chicago. Chicago is a very typical North American city, with all the hallmarks that large urban centers have. We can therefore use it to accurately represent the majority of similar cities all around the world. In total, Chicago pollutes about 34.7 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents per year. That's equivalent to 12 tons per person, or 32 tons per household. Emissions from the transportation sector in Chicago region make up 31% of the total, nearly 11 million metric tons per year. In the Chicago area alone, 56 million miles per year are traveled by motorized vehicles. Lowering the emissions from these trips is essential to lowering the city's carbon footprint. Not only does research show that it could make up 20% of the total greenhouse gas reductions in the region, but it could also save households thousands of dollars a year. Location efficiency research has shown that more efficient land use and better transportation alternatives would reduce the need for driving and automobile ownership as a whole. Households in areas with an advanced transit system use on average 8% less of their total income to pay for transportation. However, more than that, the reduced use of motorized vehicles would lower pollution and improve air quality throughout the area. However, it would be even better to encourage more people to use alternative modes of transportation. Studies have shown that almost a third of all trips in Chicago are shorter than a mile, and 50% are under 2. Encouraging people to bike or walk these shorter trips would significantly lower the carbon footprint of the city. Approximately 490,000 trips are taken by pedestrians each year, either on a bike or just simply walking. Doubling that number to 980,000 would reduce CO2 emissions by over 1,200 metric tons a year. When it comes to such a huge global issue, every small bit adds up. When it comes to a city like Chicago, it would take a myriad of small things working together to lower emissions to a sustainable level.
One of the main approaches that are being taken to reduce transportation emissions is through the promotion and use of public transportation. To put it simply, when people take public transit, it replaces the emissions that their individual vehicles would have produced with one smaller net emission. Making public transportation more accessible to those who live farther away from urban centers is also important. It gives them an option to take transit into the city rather than driving every time. Therefore, on a large scale, if we invest in this infrastructure, we can make public transportation a more viable option for day-to-day life. Another main approach being taken to reduce emission in the transportation sector is through the use of electric vehicles. As the technology behind electric and cleaner fuel alternative vehicles improves, as well as their accessibility and affordability, more and more people will switch over from gas-fueled cars, which in turn will slash cities' transportation emissions. This slash in emissions can already be seen. In Chicago, a plan to implement buses with more efficient fuels has been conceived. This fuel change is expected to reduce emissions by 100,000 tons of carbon dioxide per year. Other emission reduction methods include increasing the reach of public transit in cities and pro-cyclist and pedestrian neighborhood designs. By increasing the number of bike paths, not only on roads, but on specific trails, we would reduce the need for motor transit and encourage the general populace to use alternative modes of transportation. To further encourage pedestrians to bike, it would be prudent to increase safety measures protecting them from traffic. By installing barriers and other similar measures, people would feel more comfortable biking their daily commute instead of polluting with their cars.
Through our research, we have determined that a key place to begin fighting climate change is in the reduction of emissions from the transportation sector in major cities. This not only makes up a huge portion of global emissions, but there is a realistic and attainable way of reducing it. Further studies could go into different cities in a variety of locations and go into the specifics of what makes those transportation systems work and what doesn't. All of this would contribute to a greener tomorrow. Thank you for watching. We hope you learned something.